Before it became the city of broad shoulders, before the railroads and the slaughterhouses and the first towers of steel, Chicago was drowning. It had been built on a swamp, on flat and sodden ground that sat barely a few feet above the surface of Lake Michigan, and the rainwater and the filth had nowhere to drain. The streets turned to mud deep enough to swallow a horse whole. Disease moved through the wards like a tide, and the dead were counted by the thousand. And so the people of that low and hopeless place did something that should not have been possible. They took hold of their own city, one brick building at a time, whole blocks of it at once, and they raised it bodily into the air. And when even that was not enough to save them, they turned and reversed the flow of an entire river. This is the story of how a sinking mud swamp lifted itself out of the muck and became the industrial heart of America. It began as almost nothing. In 1833, the settlement clustered around Fort Dearborn, where the sluggish Chicago River emptied into Lake Michigan, held perhaps 350 people. The local tribes had a name for the place. They called it Chigagu, the wild garlic place, after the pungent wild onion that grew thick in the wet ground along the water. It was a fitting name for what the land was. It was flat and low and half-drowned. The site sat only a little higher than the lake itself, and in a landscape that level, water does not run away. It simply sits and waits and rots. For a while, that hardly mattered. A few hundred souls can live lightly on soft ground, but Chicago was not going to stay small. The railroads were coming, and the harvest of an entire continent was about to pass through this single point on the map. By 1850, nearly 30,000 people lived here. 10 years later, that number had passed 100,000. A frontier village had become a city almost overnight, and it still had the drainage of a swamp. The reckoning came in the form of disease. The streets, churned into a black paste by wheels and hooves, held standing pools of stagnant water that never dried. Horses and carriages mired themselves to the axle in the muck of the main thoroughfares, and in the wet seasons whole intersections became shallow ponds that lingered for weeks. Waste from the privies and the stables seeped down into the same ground the city drew its life from. And no one yet understood how sickness truly spread. The idea that filthy water carried death was only in those very years being proven an ocean away in the back streets of London. In Chicago, the proof came in bodies. Cholera struck in 1852 and then again, harder, in 1854. In that second wave, the sickness killed something close to 1 in every 20 people in the city. A person could wake healthy in the morning and be gone by nightfall. Dysentery and typhoid settled in as permanent residents. The swamp that the city had been built upon was, slowly and quietly, killing the people who lived on it. Chicago faced a simple and terrible choice. It could drain itself or it could die. Draining a city means building sewers, and sewers need somewhere to run downhill. This was the heart of the problem, and it seemed to have no answer at all. Chicago was already at the level of the lake. There was no downhill. To bury pipes deep enough to carry the waste away, engineers would have had to dig down into a waterlogged mess of clay and hardpan that filled back in with water as fast as it could be opened. It was judged all but impossible and ruinously expensive besides. In 1855, the city's newly formed Board of Sewerage Commissioners brought in a man named Ellis Chesbrough. He was 42 years old, a largely self-taught engineer who had built the water system of Boston, and he looked at Chicago's impossible problem and arrived at an answer of breathtaking audacity. If the city could not dig down to meet the sewers, then the city would have to come up to meet them. He would lay the great pipes above the old ground, running down the middle of the streets, and then bury them under many feet of new earth. The roads would rise. The whole grade of the city would rise along with them, and the buildings, thousands of them, already standing, already lived in, would simply have to be lifted up to the new level of the world. It would be the first comprehensive sewer system ever built by an American city, And it would come at a price that no city had ever thought to pay. It sounds like madness. It very nearly was, but in January of 1858, it began. The first building they raised was a four-story brick structure at the corner of Randolph and Dearborn, weighing something on the order of 750 tons. Workmen dug beneath its foundations and set more than 200 jack screws under the walls. Then, on a signal, men turned the screws by hand, a fraction of a turn each, all of them together, and the building rose. Slowly, evenly, without a single crack in the brick, it climbed more than 6 feet into the air. That year, some 50 more buildings followed it upward. The city gained confidence, and its ambition grew with it. By 1860, the engineers attempted something that drew astonished crowds. On Lake Street, between Clark and LaSalle, stood half a city block of masonry buildings, some of them 5 stories tall, a solid mass of brick and stone stretching more than 300 feet and weighing an estimated 35,000 tons. They would raise all of it at once. 600 men were put to the task, each one responsible for 10 of the 6,000 jack screws placed beneath the block. On the signal, every man turned his screws a single notch, and the entire block, shops and offices and all, lifted a fraction of an inch. Again the signal came, and again it rose. For 4 or 5 days this went on, the great mass of the city creeping upward, while clerks sold their goods and customers browsed inside, most of them scarcely aware that the floor beneath their feet was climbing toward the sky. Among the young engineers who made their name on that block was a man called George Pullman, who would go on to build a railcar empire on the fortune and the reputation he first earned by lifting buildings out of the mud. Some of the stories from those years sound almost like fables. The Tremont House, the finest hotel in the city, a vast building of brick, was raised inch by inch over several days, while its guests went on eating and sleeping inside, one of them a United States Senator, and it was said that many of them never noticed a thing. The buildings judged too flimsy to lift. The old wooden houses of the early village were not thrown away. They were set on rollers and pushed bodily through the streets to the edges of town. And there are accounts of families going about their day inside as their homes rolled slowly past the neighbors. Across roughly 2 decades, foot by foot and block by block, Chicago hauled itself upward, somewhere between 4 and 14 feet in all, until the swamp lay buried beneath it and the streets ran dry at last. It was one of the strangest and most stubborn feats of engineering the world had ever seen, accomplished not by a single genius, but by hundreds of anonymous men turning screws in unison. And it worked. The water drained away, the mud slowly receded, and the city had, quite literally, pulled itself up out of the ground that had been killing it. But there is a cruelty hidden inside this triumph, and Chicago was about to discover it. The new sewers carried the city's waste away from the streets exactly as they had been designed to do. The trouble was where they carried it. Everything flowed into the Chicago River, and the Chicago River flowed into Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan was where the city drew its drinking water. At first, the lake was vast enough to swallow the filth without complaint, and Chesbro had counted on exactly that. But the city that had lifted itself out of the swamp did not stop growing. Between 1860 and 1870, the population tripled yet again. More people meant more waste, and more waste meant a river running thick with sewage and slaughterhouse blood, pouring day and night into the very water the city drank. The engineering that had saved Chicago from the mud had quietly handed it a new way to die, one that arrived through the kitchen tap. The fight, it turned out, was only half over, and what Chicago would try next makes the raising of the buildings look almost modest. The first attempts were clever, and they were not enough. Engineers dug tunnels out beneath the floor of Lake Michigan, 2 miles from shore, to draw drinking water from far past the polluted shallows. The elegant stone water tower that still stands on Michigan Avenue was raised to serve that very system, and it would become one of the few structures downtown to survive the fire that was coming. Yet, as the city swelled, the tide of sewage simply spread farther out into the lake and reached the intakes anyway. The river itself remained an open sewer. On the south side, a dead-end channel behind the stockyards took in so much blood and offal and rotting matter that it bubbled with its own gas and earned a name that has never left it. They called it Bubbly Creek, and in places it was said to be thick enough to walk across. There had even been an early attempt, back in 1871, to deepen an old canal and coax the river into draining the other way. But that channel was too shallow to hold the flow, and before long the river slid back into its old and deadly course, carrying the poison home to the lake once more. If you have followed this city through the mud and the sickness and the slow lifting of its streets, then stay with it a little longer, because what Chicago does next is the part almost no one remembers. By the 1880s, the situation had become intolerable. A great storm in 1885 flushed the filth of the river far out into the lake, close enough to the water intakes to frighten the entire city, and though the catastrophe people dreaded did not in fact arrive, the fright alone was enough. The citizens demanded a permanent end to it. And the answer they finally settled on was so vast, so utterly defiant of nature, that it still seems scarcely believable. They would not merely clean the river, they would make it run backward. The Chicago River had, for as long as anyone had ever known, flowed into Lake Michigan. The plan was to reverse it completely, to force it to flow away from the lake instead, carrying the city's waste with it, down and out toward the valley of the Mississippi. In 1889, the state of Illinois created the Sanitary District of Chicago and handed it that single staggering task. On a September day in 1892, officials broke the first ground on what would become the Sanitary and Ship Canal, a channel 28 miles long, cut through earth and solid rock to connect the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River, and through it to the Illinois River, and at last to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. It was the largest earth-moving project the continent had ever attempted. For the better part of 8 years, an army of some 8,500 workers tore the canal out of the ground. The machines and the men who learned their trade there would go on, only a few years later, to help dig the Panama Canal. Then, in January of 1900, quietly, almost in secret, to head off the lawsuits already gathering from the furious cities downstream, the final barrier was cut away. The water hesitated. And then, the Chicago River began to run the other way, backward against its own history, draining the city away from the lake it had been poisoning for half a century. Chicagoans crowded onto the bridges and the docks to watch the current turn. It remains one of the boldest acts of civil engineering this country has ever attempted, honored decades later as one of the 7 wonders of American engineering. The city had beaten the water at last. It had beaten it twice. And now we come to the reason that all of it mattered, because a city does not perform 2 of history's great engineering miracles simply in order to survive. It does it in order to become something. And what Chicago became, standing at last on dry and solid ground, was the beating industrial heart of a continent. Everything the country grew and dug and slaughtered west of the Appalachians now flowed through this one point on the map. The railroads had chosen Chicago, and by the 1850s it was already the greatest rail center in the nation, the place where the lines of the East reached out and met the vast open lands of the West. On swampland just beyond the old city limits, 9 railroads and a handful of meat packers joined together and opened the Union Stockyards on Christmas Day of 1865. It rose, fittingly enough, on drained marsh with pens enough to hold 100,000 hogs and 10,000 head of cattle at a time. The sheer scale of what happened there is difficult to hold in the mind. By 1870, the yards handled 2 million animals in a year. By 1890, it was 9 million. From the years of the Civil War until the 1920s, more meat was processed in Chicago than anywhere else on the face of the earth. Men like Philip Armour built the great slaughtering houses, where the carcasses moved along overhead rails from worker to worker in a grim and ceaseless line, a disassembly line that a young Henry Ford would one day study and turn on its head into the moving assembly line that built his automobiles. With the coming of the refrigerated rail car, an animal could be born in Texas, killed in Chicago, and eaten in New York. The poet Carl Sandburg gave the city the name that would cling to it forever: Hog Butcher for the World. It was a fortune built on blood, and it was not gentle work, and the men and women who did it, wave after wave of arriving immigrants, paid for the city's greatness with their bodies and their years. That too is part of the story, and it should not be lost in the telling. Then, in 1871, the city that had refused to drown came very close to burning instead. The Great Chicago Fire swept through the heart of downtown and left much of it in ash. And Chicago, being Chicago, treated even that as an opportunity. It rebuilt, and this time it built in stone and iron and a new material called structural steel. In 1885, on LaSalle Street, an engineer named William LeBaron Jenney completed a 10-story office building hung upon a skeleton of steel. The home insurance building, remembered ever since as the first true skyscraper in the world. The city that had lifted its buildings a few feet out of the mud had learned, in the span of a single generation, how to raise them 1,000 feet into the sky. By the turn of the century, the wild garlic place of 350 souls held well over 1 million people, and it was still climbing toward the 3 million it would one day contain, from a half-drowned village to a towering metropolis in the space of a single human lifetime. And yet, if you stand in Chicago today, almost none of that struggle is visible. It is buried, quite literally, beneath your feet. The old ground level of the drowning city still lies down there in the dark, 6 feet and more below the sidewalks, the true floor of the swamp that Chicago climbed out of. The river still runs backward, obediently, to this very day, held to its unnatural course by the will of engineers who have been dead for more than 120 years. We remember the skyline, the towers of glass, the broad shoulders. We forget the mud. We forget the thousands who died in the cholera years, and the anonymous men who turned the screws, and the workers in the killing houses whose labor paid for all of it. That is perhaps the quiet lesson of old Chicago, that the grandest things a people ever build tend to rest directly on top of the hardest things they ever survived, and that in time, the survival is forgotten, and only the grandeur is left standing. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the buried kind, the hard-won kind, there is another story waiting for you on the screen right now of another American city that paid a price the world has largely chosen to forget.